Kwekwe, Wabjizin and Pipanesi Indigenicas, Mishkinabik Nindodem, Kitchissippi, Dunjba. So we call the Great River Kitchissippi, which means Great River. Historically, that's the name that we called it. It became the Ottawa River or the Odawa River because of the Odawa people that were here trading. But before that time, like way back, we just knew it as the Great River or the Grand River. And it was the highway for our ancestors, for our Algonquin ancestors, for our Métis ancestors. Back in the day, there were no highways, there were no roads, so we had to use the waterways as our way to get around. So we used the Kitchissippi from Montreal right up to Lake Temiskaming and all the tributaries that flow into the Kitchissippi.
The mighty Kitchissippi River flows swiftly from the shores of Lake Temiskaming in the north, 1,271 kilometers southward to the St. Lawrence River in Montreal. The name Temiskaming is Algonquin and means deep body of water with rapid winds.
There was a geological fault 2.2 billion years ago that created this depression, which became the lake. And then through millions of years, it was a big ocean, and fossils were formed, and which created the limestone beds that we see. And then the glaciers came along and scraped the limestone away most places, and until where we are now.
The city of Temiskaming Shores is a bustling community composed of 3 former municipalities of Hallaberry, New Liskeard, and Diamond. The community is located at the head of Lake Temiskaming, and the lake stretches over 100 kilometers south before becoming the Ottawa River. Today, the lake is a boating and fishing paradise with over 30 species of fish and many fascinating and historic features to explore, like the Devil's Rock. Located 5 kilometers south of the community of Hallaberry, Ontario, the Devil's Rock rises 91 meters above the lake. There are hiking trails that will lead you to the top of the rock, and the view is spectacular. Visible from the water below are 5 tunnels that were blasted into the cliff face between 1907 and 1912. The people that created these tunnels were searching for silver. Fort Temiskaming was a trading post from the 17th century near Ville Marie, Canada, on the fur trade route on the east shore of Lake Temiskaming. The fort is a National Historic Site operated as part of the National Park System by Parks Canada and in partnership with the Temiskaming First Nation.
Fort Temiskaming have a very long history. The Algonquin used to live on this site in the summertime 6,000 years ago. It was their summer gathering place where they would fish, they would pick up blueberries, strawberries, all the fruits, all the medicinal herbs. Since Ottawa River and the Lake Temiskaming were the highway, the only way of transportation then was by canoe. The Algonquin had the science of how to make a canoe. They would make canoes for the use of the fort, but the canoe that was used by the voyageur to bring the merchandise from Montreal and then the fur back to Montreal were a huge canoe made by a man in Montreal that was called LeMay. He designed the canoe adapted to the fur trade. There would be 8 to 11 men in a canoe, 3 tons of cargo in each canoe. From Montreal to here was 25 days. 25 days of paddling, 13 to 14 hours a day. There were 21 portage. So can you imagine in the summertime, in the big heat with all the mosquito, they had to empty 3 tons of cargo at each portage. Some voyageurs would carry on their back 3 bundles of fur weighing 90 pounds each. The mosquitoes were like crazy. So they had a good recipe to avoid the mosquito. They would mix bear grease with skunk oil and they would put that all over their body. They would arrive here after 25 days if everything went well, if they didn't try to pass through a rapid and lose all the shipment. And then over here, they would have a good meal and a big jug of rum. And they would stay for 3 to 4 days to rest a little bit, but they were working for the chief trader.
The Ottawa River is home to 8 national historic sites and numerous pioneer villages, interpretive centers, community museums, and historic houses. The Great Fire of 1922 has been called one of the 10 worst natural disasters in Canadian history. On October 4th, a wildfire swept into the town of Hallabury. Thick smoke caused panic and confusion, and the town's residents were forced to take refuge in the cold waters of Lake Temiskaming and cover themselves with wet blankets. The fire destroyed over 90% of the town, killing 11 residents, leaving 3,500 people homeless and causing $2 million of damage. Area resident and one of Canada's most prolific sculptors, Ernie Fauvel, created a masterpiece entitled Pioneer Spirit, commemorating the Great Fire.
And it took the town out. It just burned everything. Killed a lot of people. You know, people even went down the well to protect themselves from the flames, but unbeknownst to them, there's no air. The air was sucked right out of it and they died. But a lot of death. The town was destroyed, really. It was really sad. And my mother was in the water. They had no other way. It was either that or die. So they went into the water, covered themselves with wet blankets, children in their arms, and spent the night doing that. When they went in the water, it was 75 degrees, the temperature, flames everywhere, dust and fire. And actually, my father didn't know Mom then, but he was on the platform trying to get people onto the train. And he was one of the last ones out. The station platform was on fire, so the train went to Cobalt and saved them.
The Kitchissippi River is very important to the Algonquin people. For thousands of years, the Algonquin people inhabited the watershed, fished in its waters, and the river connected First Nation communities on both sides of the Kitchissippi. As a result of colonization, First Nation communities were forcibly dislocated from the watershed and their homes. But the Kitchissippi remains a powerful connection to their land, their unceded territory, their history, and to all of the ancestors and communities that came before.
Our river, Kitchissippi, the Great River, was significant not just because it was a route or a way of traveling and getting across the back of Turtle Island. We consider water sacred, so even though it's our highway, it's our way to get around, it's the sacred element of water. So there was just inherent reverence and respect for the riverway because of everything that it provided for us. You know, food, fish, ways to migrate and move around from summer camps to winter camps. It's also spoken of long ago with our migration story, where our ancestors migrated from the East Coast or from the place of the great salt water and the different stopping points along the way. One of them being outside of Montreal, and then further up the Kitchissippi, up the Mattawa, all the way up into the Great Lakes, all the 7 stopping points along the way. So even in this day and age, our river is sacred because of what it provides to us as a way to navigate through our territory, through our world. And evidence of that is still present in pictographs, in burial sites, places that are still sacred, but a lot of people don't know that they're there because of the damming and the flooding. But we believe that if we spend time out on the river or out on the land or up in the highlands, that we can connect with our ancestors, and they will teach us about our original uses of our territory.
6,000-year-old copper tools have been found on the shores of the Ottawa River. All of the early settler communities, including the picturesque community of Mattawa, Ontario, that emerged along the Ottawa River watershed, were first connected by the fur trade and later by the lumber industry.
Mattawa is the fur trade. Mattawa is the junction of the Ottawa and the Mattawa, which is the junction of the to go west. So anybody that was going west to gather furs, to harvest, passed through the shores, and actually the footprint that we're actually doing this interview on, we're just a few feet away from where the original Hudson Bay post was. The Métis people that came here to Mattawa actually had to land on the point that we are, on the Explorers Point that we are here today. And basically they were mainly French, came here, married First Nations women, and those First Nations women's families is what taught the European men how to trap, how to canoe, how to look after themselves in the forest, because they literally knew squat, or very little. So the culture for the Métis in this area was very, very strong, and continues to be, very strong. The fur trade, very, very healthy area for fur, very rich, lots of water, probably more water than we have land, from lakes to rivers. As the fur trade started to get less because they were taking too much, there was a group of families that had to adapt. Some of them adapted by working the guidings in the summertime, and the other part started in the logging era. A lot of the new generations didn't take the harvesting of in the fur trapping. It was a difficult profession, and it was something that was very hard because the animals were getting scarce. So the transition period happened around the late 1800s. Instead of the large trapping, it became the logging. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were in that transition. His father, which was my great-great-great-grandfather, he had been part of the fur trade.
There are over 30 beaches along the Ottawa River, and hundreds of thousands of people swim, fish, paddle, sail, and powerboat on the river every year. As you travel down the Ottawa River from Mattawa towards Pembroke, passing the communities of Deux Rivières, Bissett Creek, Stonecliff, Rolfton, Point Alexander, Deep River, Chalk River, and Petawawa, you realize that this great waterway is still as inspiring and grand as it must have been when Champlain first explored this area in 1613. And if you know where to look, you can find evidence of a much older civilization.
The content of our traditional teachings, it's not superstition, it's not folktale, it was our way of life. It was how we existed and how we survived on the land and how we moved around. And that stuff is coming back, that content is coming back, but a lot of people are just starting to learn it as they understand who they are as Métis people or as Algonquin people. So the teachings never really went away, the stories never went away, the legends never went away. And if we're open-minded and open-hearted, we can access that world or that realm. So around this area, there's areas where people did ceremony, where they would fast and do vision quests. A name for sites like that was the Thunderbird Nest. The most obvious Thunderbird Nest site is down across from Petawawa. That's called Oiseau Rock or Bird Rock, or Kitchissippi, which means Thunderbird Rock. So that's an example of a very, very old, ancient, probably 10,000-year-old sacred site that our ancestors were using. The pictographs are painted there, but that's only one example of a Thunderbird Nest type of site.
Oiseau Rock is a very sacred First Nations site that rises 150 meters above the Ottawa River. The early ancestors of the Algonquin people believed this is where the great Thunderbird lived. And there's a panel of ancient pictographs that are still visible along the face of the cliff. These ancient paintings were made with red ochre and are a direct link to an ancient civilization that used this site as a gathering point for thousands of years. Many species of birds can be seen at Wuzzo Rock, including the peregrine falcon. The site also features a 4.5-kilometer hiking trail that will lead you to an amazing view of the Ottawa River. There is also a freshwater lake on the summit for swimming. The ancient ancestors of the Algonquin people believed that this lake had healing properties.
So we're sitting here on the shores of the Kitchissippi, as the indigenous people call the Great River, and it was the historic waterway for all travel up and down the Ottawa Valley for millennia. Dating back as far as 6,500 years ago, there were Aboriginal Algonquin settlements on Morrison's Island, just a kilometer or two downstream from here, where Chief Tessawat reigned supreme, extracting a toll on all of the other Aboriginal groups that came down the river. So there's a 6,000-year history of Aboriginal travel up and down the river. Following that, the fur trade evolved, the courrier de bois, the voyageurs, ultimately the lumber trade, and the river has been the highway 417, in the words of our late friend Len Hopkins. It was the Highway 417 of Canada. And in fact, this river opened the country to further exploration. So for many, many years, 100 years roughly, the log drives took place down the Ottawa River, and they took place in the form of square timber. And those square timbers were created in the bush and then skidded out with horses into the river. And when they hit the river, they were then assembled into what is called a crib being about 20 huge white pine timbers. And the cribs were all put together to form a raft. And these large rafts of squared timbers sailed down the Ottawa River. They had to go through the rapids, being taken apart, and then go through the rapids and reassembled at the base of the rapids. And then finally they would get to what is now the Port of Montreal, where they would be loaded in the hulls of large ships and shipped over to Britain to make the masts for the big sailing ships. Canada basically saved the British Empire, because when Napoleon blockaded Britain, they had no source of lumber anymore, because the source from the Baltic was blockaded by Napoleon. So Britain turned to Canada. Canada came through with all the squared timbers to support the British Navy.
For 6 generations, the Shaw family has been a pillar in the Ottawa Valley forest industry. To commemorate the 100th anniversary of the last J.R. Booth timber drive down the Ottawa River, the Shaws, along with a large group of community partners, built a timber crib and floated it from Horton Township to Ottawa. The crib is a symbol of how important the lumber industry has been to the Ottawa Valley and to Canada, and now has a permanent home along Pembroke's historic waterfront.
Started out as a project, and it worked into a summer that you'll never forget. That it was, to be able to relive it and to show it to people. It was just a great summer. There's so many areas along the Ottawa River that had the fast water with the rapids, and before the days that there were areas that they built slides to take the crib down in an orderly way, but there was a lot of them that they would either be connected, and then they would disconnect a crib, and then they would shoot the crib, and you just had oars, and it was very dangerous, because if you hit a rock and if one of the timbers came through, that it would come apart, and you're in the cold water in the spring and early summer and it there was no life jackets, or there was no spotters for you.
In 1806, the first raft of logs was floated down the Ottawa River.
During the logging era, both the square timber era and the era they call the saw log era, where round logs were floated down, they needed a boat capable of maneuvering in very, very shallow water. And Jack Cockburn Pointer boat was developed right here in Pembroke, and the area that the monument is was referred to as Cockburn Inlet. And the Cockburn Pointer boat shop was there. These boats had the reputation of being able to float on a heavy dew, and were shipped all over the world to lumbering operations everywhere. So in celebration of that, the Pointer boat has been memorialized by the Ottawa Valley Historical Society with the Pointer Boat Monument, and also the Pointer boat built by the local high school students sits atop the timber crib to remind us of the importance that this area had in the logging era for hundreds of years. Well, I think when Pembroke decided informally to title this park the Jewel of Pembroke, I believe they hit the nail on the head. You can come down here anytime, night or day, and find all manner of people from all over the country coming here to visit the Pembroke Waterfront Park. And being situated as it is here on this magnificent river is just a real jewel.
More than 300 species of birds have been identified along the river, and there are 96 species of fish, including 50 at-risk species. As the river continues to flow through the Ottawa Valley, it passes through the Whitewater region. Historically, this was a very dangerous section of the river, claiming the lives of many voyageurs and log drivers. Today, this section of the river is a world-class whitewater rafting destination and very popular with kayaking professionals and paddling enthusiasts. This section of the river is also part of the Ottawa River Provincial Park. From here, the river flows southeast to Ottawa and Gatineau, where it tumbles over Chaudière Falls. The falls is a sacred site for the Algonquin people and was used as a gathering place for First Nation communities for thousands of years. The falls was named in 1613 by Samuel de Champlain, who was the first European to explore the Ottawa River, and the falls proved to be a challenge and an obstacle for both the fur trade and the lumber industry. Continuing down the river past Chaudière Falls, the towers of Ottawa's Parliament buildings come into view. Recreational boats and tourist cruise ships fill the river in the summer months. And the Ottawa River watershed is also home to the Canadian Museum of History. Once you've left the nation's capital, the river flows past Hawkesbury, back into Quebec, and on its way to Montreal, where the Ottawa River meets the St. Lawrence. In 2017, the Government of Canada designated the Ottawa River a Canadian Heritage River for the cultural, historical, and recreational role it plays in Canadian society. The role that the Ottawa River has played and continues to play in the history and development of Canada is one that should be remembered, acknowledged, and celebrated for generations to come.